May 15, 1945. Glucksburg Castle, northern Germany. Albert Speer sat in a leather chair, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, watching American interrogators arrange their notepads and recording equipment across the mahogany table. For 7 days straight, he had been answering their questions with a candor that shocked even hardened intelligence officers. Paul Nitze, the economist leading the interrogation, later recalled that Speer evoked in us a sympathy of which we were all secretly ashamed. The man across from them had been Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, the architect of Germany's wartime industrial miracle, the technocrat who had kept German factories running even as Allied bombs rained down on them day and night. He had overseen the exploitation of millions of slave laborers. He had been one of the few men with direct, regular access to Adolf Hitler. He had directed an economy that produced 17,300 tanks in 1944 alone, tripling output from just 2 years earlier. And now, with Germany in ruins and Hitler dead by his own hand just 15 days earlier, Speer was telling the Americans something that no other senior Nazi official would admit. Something that struck at the heart of why Germany lost the war. Something about American industrial capacity that German leadership had refused to believe until it was far too late. The war was lost, Speer said quietly, the moment America entered it. We simply did not have the industrial resources to compete. If you made it this far, you're officially a good viewer. The next mission? Hit the subscribe button so your effort doesn't go to waste. The Americans leaned forward. They wanted specifics. They wanted numbers. They wanted to understand how Germany, which had conquered most of Europe and built weapons that were technologically superior to anything the Allies fielded, could lose a war of production to a nation that had been at peace just 4 years earlier. Speer began to explain, and what he revealed in that interrogation room, what he would later expand upon in his memoirs and testimony at Nuremberg, represented one of the most honest assessments any defeated nation's leader had ever given about why his side lost. The story begins not in 1945, but in the 1930s, when Adolf Hitler appointed a young architect named Albert Speer to redesign Berlin into Germania, the capital of a thousand-year Reich. Speer was born on March 19, 1905, in Mannheim, Germany, into a wealthy family of architects. He studied at the technical universities in Karlsruhe, Munich, and Berlin, where he fell under the spell of Adolf Hitler's oratory in 1930. By 1934, Speer had become Hitler's personal architect, designing the monumental structures that would embody Nazi ideology. The Nuremberg rally grounds, the new Reich Chancellery in Berlin, plans for a great hall that would hold 180,000 people under a dome large enough to fit St. Peter's Basilica inside it. Hitler and Speer would spend hours together, poring over architectural drawings, discussing the buildings that would define their new Germany. But on February 8, 1942, everything changed. Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments and Munitions, died in a plane crash shortly after taking off from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Within hours, Hitler summoned Speer and appointed him to take Todt's place. The architect would become an industrialist. The man who designed buildings would now oversee the production of every bullet, tank, aircraft, and artillery piece Germany needed to win the war. Speer was shocked by his appointment. He later wrote that he had no qualifications for the job, no experience managing industrial production, no technical knowledge of weapons manufacturing. But Hitler trusted him. Hitler believed that Speer's organizational genius, demonstrated in his architectural projects, would translate to armaments production. And for a time, it seemed Hitler was right. When Speer took over the Ministry of Armaments in February 1942, German production was shockingly inefficient. Factories worked single shifts. Resources were wasted through bureaucratic infighting between the Army, Navy, Air Force, and various Nazi Party organizations. Production methods were antiquated. Germany, which had started the war, was producing fewer weapons than Britain, which was fighting for its survival. Speer immediately began implementing reforms that would become known as the Armaments miracle. He centralized control over production, stripping power from the competing military branches and Nazi Party functionaries. He placed industrialists and engineers in charge of production, people who understood manufacturing, rather than party loyalists. He standardized designs, reducing the number of different tank models from dozens to just a handful. Most importantly, Speer rationalized production. German factories had been producing 12 different types of anti-tank weapons. Speer reduced this to 1. They had built 55 different vehicle types. He cut this to 15. When he took control of aircraft production in July 1944, he reduced the number of plane models from 42 to 5. The results were staggering. In 1941, before Speer took over, Germany produced 9,540 tanks and assault guns. In 1944, under Speer's direction, production reached 35,350. Tank production had nearly quadrupled. Aircraft production doubled. Ammunition production tripled. German propaganda trumpeted these achievements. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, worked closely with Speer to ensure the German people heard about every production milestone. Film crews followed Speer as he toured factories, showing him inspecting new tanks, congratulating workers, and demonstrating Germany's industrial might. The message was clear. Germany was producing enough weapons to win the war. But Speer knew something that the propaganda carefully avoided mentioning. Something that kept him awake at night in his office at the ministry. Something that made every production report, no matter how impressive the numbers looked, feel like a hollow victory. Germany's production increases, remarkable as they were, meant nothing when compared to what America was producing. Speer had access to intelligence reports about Allied production. He saw the numbers. He did the calculations. And he understood with mathematical certainty that Germany could not win a war of industrial attrition against the United States. In 1941, the United States produced 4,052 tanks. By 1944, that number had exploded to 17,565. But that wasn't the full picture. The United States wasn't just producing tanks for itself. It was supplying Britain, which produced 27,696 tanks during the war. It was supplying the Soviet Union, which produced 99,150 tanks, supplemented by 11,900 Lend-Lease vehicles from America. The math was brutal. From 1939 to 1945, Germany produced approximately 46,274 tanks and assault guns. During the same period, the Soviet Union alone produced more than twice that number. When you added American production, British production, and American vehicles sent to both countries, the Allies produced roughly 4 times as many armored vehicles as Germany. And tanks were just the beginning. America produced 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced just under 120,000. America built more than 500,000 artillery pieces. Germany managed about 160,000. America launched dozens of aircraft carriers. Germany never completed a single one. The disparity extended to every category of war production. America produced 2.6 million trucks during the war. These seemingly mundane vehicles were crucial for logistics, allowing American forces to keep their armies supplied no matter how far they advanced. Germany produced just 620,000 trucks, and most of these were requisitioned from conquered territories or came in dozens of different models that required different spare parts. One statistic captured the disparity better than any other: steel production. In 1944, the United States produced 89.9 million tons of steel. Germany, even with access to the industrial resources of conquered Europe, produced just 28.5 million tons. Britain added 12 million tons. The Soviet Union, despite losing vast industrial territory to German invasion, still managed 12 million tons. Steel was the foundation of industrial war. Every tank, every ship, every artillery piece, every rifle required steel. And Germany was producing less than a quarter of what its enemies combined were producing. Speer understood these numbers better than anyone else in the German leadership. While other Nazi officials engaged in wishful thinking, talking about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, Speer dealt with industrial reality. He knew that Germany was being outproduced in every category that mattered. He knew that every German tank destroyed would be harder to replace than every American tank knocked out. He knew that attrition favored the Allies. But in Nazi Germany, telling Hitler the truth about Germany's industrial inferiority was dangerous. Hitler believed in willpower, in the superiority of German workers, in the racial destiny of the Aryan people. He dismissed concerns about production numbers. He believed that one German soldier was worth 10 American soldiers, that German tanks were superior to Allied tanks, that German military genius would overcome any material disadvantage. And there was some truth to Hitler's beliefs about quality. The German Panzer tank, introduced in 1943, was superior to the American M4 Sherman in almost every way. It had better armor, a more powerful gun, better optics. The Tiger tank, with its 88mm gun, could destroy an Allied tank from ranges where Allied guns couldn't penetrate Tiger armor. But quality didn't matter when you were outnumbered 4-1. A single Panther might destroy 3 Shermans before being knocked out, but the Americans would bring 6 more. German tank aces could rack up impressive kill counts, but every German tank lost was irreplaceable, while Allied losses were made up within weeks by ships arriving from American factories. The Eastern Front demonstrated this mathematical reality most starkly. From June 1941 to May 1945, Germany lost approximately 42,700 tanks, tank destroyers, self-propelled guns, and assault guns fighting the Soviet Union. Even with Speer's production increases, Germany simply could not replace these losses fast enough. Soviet tank production alone exceeded German production. When German forces destroyed Soviet tanks, the Red Army brought up more, and still more. The factories that had been evacuated east of the Urals in 1941, beyond the reach of German bombers, produced an endless stream of T-34 tanks that, while individually inferior to German designs, collectively overwhelmed German armor through sheer numbers. And unlike Germany, which had to fight on multiple fronts, the Soviet Union could concentrate almost its entire production against Germany. While Germany struggled to defend against Soviet forces in the east, American and British forces in the west, Allied bombing raids from the air, and maintained garrisons across occupied Europe, the Soviets faced essentially one enemy. The strategic bombing campaign made Germany's production disadvantage even worse. Starting in 1943, British and American bombers began systematically destroying German industrial capacity. The RAF bombed cities at night, disrupting production and killing workers. The USAAF bombed specific targets during the day: factories, refineries, transportation networks. Speer worked miracles keeping production going despite the bombing. He dispersed factories. He moved production underground. He rebuilt bombed facilities with remarkable speed. But every bomb that fell on Germany represented resources diverted from war production. Germany produced 88mm anti-aircraft guns to defend its cities, guns that could have been used as anti-tank weapons on the front lines. Germany built fighters to defend against bombers, aircraft that could have supported ground operations. Germany devoted massive resources to air defense, resources that America didn't need because German bombers never threatened American cities. The Allied bombing campaign revealed another American advantage: technological sophistication combined with mass production. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the bomber that pounded German cities and factories, represented American industrial philosophy perfectly. It wasn't the most advanced bomber design theoretically possible, but it was reliable, maintainable, and most importantly, producible in vast quantities. America produced 12,731 B-17s during the war. When Germany's defenses shot one down, another arrived from American factories to take its place. And another, and another. The mathematics of attrition worked against Germany in the air just as they did on the ground. By late 1944, Speer could see the end approaching. Allied forces were advancing from the east and west. German cities were being reduced to rubble. The transportation network was collapsing under sustained bombing. The synthetic fuel plants that provided Germany's limited petroleum supplies were being systematically destroyed, immobilizing the tanks and aircraft Germany still managed to produce. On January 13, 1945, Speer gave a presentation to German Army Corps commanders near Berlin. He recited production statistics: 218,000 rifles produced in December 1944 alone, nearly double the monthly average in 1941. Automatic weapons production up by 4 times. Tank production up by 5 times, with the newer tanks being much heavier and better armed than earlier models. The numbers sounded impressive. But Speer carefully avoided comparing German production to Allied production. He didn't mention that the Allies had destroyed Germany's transportation network so thoroughly that the weapons being produced couldn't reach the front lines. He didn't mention that Germany's fuel shortage meant that tanks often sat immobile for lack of gasoline. He didn't mention that the soldiers to man these weapons no longer existed, that Germany was conscripting 15-year-old boys and 60-year-old men because the army had run out of able-bodied adults. Most importantly, he didn't mention that Germany's production, impressive as it had become under his management, was utterly dwarfed by what America was producing. In March 1945, with Soviet forces closing on Berlin from the east and American forces crossing the Rhine in the west, Adolf Hitler issued what became known as the Nero Decree. Named after the Roman emperor who supposedly fiddled while Rome burned, the decree ordered the destruction of all German industrial facilities, infrastructure, and resources that might fall into enemy hands. If Germany couldn't win, Hitler reasoned, then Germany should be destroyed along with its enemies. Speer was horrified. For the first time in his career, he openly defied Hitler. He issued orders to ignore the Nero Decree. He traveled across Germany, meeting with military commanders and local officials, instructing them to preserve industrial facilities for Germany's future. He sabotaged Hitler's scorched earth policy at considerable personal risk, understanding that Germany would need these resources to rebuild after the war. But Speer's defiance came too late to change Germany's fate. The mathematical reality of industrial production had doomed Germany years earlier. The war was effectively lost in 1942, when German forces failed to capture the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus, and when America's industrial mobilization began to accelerate. Everything after that point was just Germany slowly bleeding to death while fighting enemies who could replace their losses faster than Germany could inflict them. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. The city he and Speer had planned to transform into Germania, capital of a thousand-year Reich, was a smoking wasteland. The building Speer had designed lay in ruins. The Reich that was supposed to last a millennium had lasted 12 years. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, and Albert Speer, unlike many other Nazi leaders who committed suicide rather than face capture, turned himself in to Allied forces. He believed he had something to offer, information about Germany's war production and, perhaps more importantly, an honest assessment of why Germany lost. Which brings us back to Glucksburg Castle on May 15, 1945, and the interrogation that would reveal truths about industrial warfare that would reshape how nations thought about military production for generations to come. Paul Nitze studied the man across the table at Glucksburg Castle with fascination tinged with revulsion. Nitze was an economist, recruited by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey to assess the effectiveness of Allied bombing campaigns. He had interviewed dozens of German officials in the weeks following Germany's surrender. But Albert Speer was different. Where other Nazis deflected, denied, or descended into ideology, Speer spoke with clinical precision about industrial capacity, production bottlenecks, and strategic miscalculations. "Tell me about German tank production," Nitze asked on that second morning of interrogation. "Your ministry increased output dramatically under your direction. Why couldn't Germany keep pace with Allied production?" Speer leaned back in his chair. The answer, he explained, wasn't primarily about bombing damage or resource shortages, though both certainly mattered. The fundamental problem was scale. Germany simply did not have the industrial base to compete with the United States. American production capacity, Speer said carefully, exceeded anything we could achieve by an order of magnitude. We were trying to match an industrial power that produced more steel in a month than we could produce in a year. He walked Nitze through mathematics. In 1944, Germany's best year under Speer's management, German factories produced approximately 35,000 tanks and assault guns. This represented a near quintupling of production since 1941. It was, by any measure, an industrial miracle. But that same year, the United States produced 17,565 tanks for its own forces. The Soviet Union produced 29,000 tanks. Britain produced another 4,000. When you added American Lend-Lease vehicles supplied to Allied armies, the total Allied production exceeded 70,000 armored vehicles in a single year. Germany's best performance was half of Allied production. And that was before calculating the cost of losses. On the Eastern Front alone, Speer told Nizza, "We lost approximately 43,000 tanks and assault guns between June 1941 and May 1945. That's more than Germany's entire production from 1939 to 1945. The mathematics were brutal. Every German tank destroyed required weeks or months to replace, given Germany's limited industrial capacity. Every American tank destroyed was replaced within weeks by ships arriving from factories that operated around the clock. The Soviets could lose entire tank armies and rebuild them from production centers beyond the Urals that German bombers could never reach." Nizza pressed for more details. What about German technological superiority? The Panther tank, the Tiger tank, these were superior vehicles to anything the Allies fielded. Shouldn't quality count for something? Speer's answer was blunt. Quality mattered only when the numbers weren't overwhelming. A Panther might destroy 3 Shermans before being knocked out. But the Americans would bring 6 more, and 8 more after that, and a dozen more after that. Eventually, numerical superiority crushed technical advantages. American pilots called it the law of averages, Speer said. Sooner or later, a lucky shot would penetrate even the best armor. And unlike Germany, America had enough tanks that losing 3 or 4 to kill 1 German vehicle was acceptable. The interrogation continued for 7 days. Each morning, Speer arrived dressed in his suit, courteous and cooperative. He answered questions about ball-bearing production, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft manufacturing, and the effectiveness of Allied bombing with remarkable candor. He took Nizza and the other interrogators through what he called bombing high school, explaining which targets had hurt Germany most and which had been disappointingly ineffective. What emerged from these interrogations was a portrait of industrial warfare that shocked even experienced American military officers. The war hadn't been decided by strategy or tactics or even by the quality of weapons. It had been decided by industrial capacity, specifically by America's ability to produce weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. Speer identified specific moments when he had understood Germany would lose. One came in 1943 when he received intelligence reports about American bomber production. The United States was producing more heavy bombers in a month than Germany produced in a year. These bombers would destroy German cities and factories while operating from bases Germany couldn't reach. Another came when he learned about American shipbuilding. The United States was launching Liberty ships, cargo vessels needed to transport supplies across the Atlantic, faster than German submarines could sink them. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched nearly 2,000 merchant vessels totaling over 19 million tons. German U-boats sank about 3.5 million tons of shipping that year, less than 20% of what America produced. The numbers repeated across every category. Artillery production. America produced 570,000 pieces during the war. Germany managed 160,000. Trucks, essential for logistics. America produced nearly 3 million. Germany made 620,000, most requisitioned from conquered territories. Aircraft. America produced 300,000. Germany built 120,000. We were, Speer told his interrogators, fighting the entire war at a disadvantage we could never overcome. Every German soldier killed, every tank destroyed, every aircraft shot down represented a loss we struggled to replace. The Americans replaced their losses and then added more. Don't overthink it. The subscribe button is not a landmine. It won't explode. Press it, you're safe. The interrogations revealed another critical factor: Germany's transportation network. Even when German factories managed to produce weapons, getting them to the front lines became increasingly impossible. Allied bombing had systematically destroyed German railways, bridges, and roads. Tanks produced in factories sat immobile for lack of fuel or couldn't reach combat zones because the trains to transport them had been destroyed. Speer explained this with grim precision. In January 1945, German factories still produced respectable numbers of tanks and aircraft. But the transportation collapse meant these weapons never reached the armies that needed them. Tanks sat in factory yards while German forces in the east and west were overrun. Aircraft couldn't fly for lack of aviation fuel, even though the planes themselves existed. By the end, Speer said, we were producing weapons for a non-existent transportation system to deliver to armies that no longer had trained crews to operate them. After a week, American authorities informed Nizza that Speer would be formally arrested and transferred to face war crimes charges. But Nizza had one final question. He wanted to know about Hitler's last days, the Führer's final orders, the bunker atmosphere as Germany collapsed. Speer obliged. He had been among the last to see Hitler alive, visiting the Führer bunker in late April even as Soviet artillery was destroying Berlin street by street. He described Hitler's final madness, the scorched earth orders that would have destroyed what remained of German infrastructure, Speer's own decision to disobey and preserve Germany's industrial capacity for post-war reconstruction. On May 23, 1945, 8 days after his initial interrogation, Albert Speer was formally arrested and charged with war crimes. In September, he was moved to Nuremberg to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal. The Nuremberg trials began on November 20, 1945. 22 Nazi officials stood accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Among them was Albert Speer, charged with using slave labor in armaments factories and participating in the conspiracy to wage aggressive war. Speer's trial testimony was remarkable. Unlike other defendants who denied everything or blamed superiors, Speer accepted responsibility for his actions. When prosecutors presented evidence of slave labor in his factories, Speer didn't deny knowledge. When they showed how his production increases had prolonged the war, Speer acknowledged it. I was responsible, he told the court. A worker who had not enough food could not achieve good work output. I knew this. Every head of a plant knew this. We were interested in having well-fed workers because hungry workers make mistakes. But knowing this made my responsibility greater, not less. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson questioned Speer directly about armaments production and Germany's ability to wage war. The exchange revealed Speer's understanding of why Germany lost. Jackson asked about German production capacity compared to Allied production. Speer's answer was devastating to any remaining Nazi propaganda about German superiority. Germany could not match American production in any category, Speer testified. The United States produced more steel, more aluminum, more rubber, more oil, more weapons. The disparity wasn't close. America's advantage was overwhelming. Jackson pressed the point. So Germany entered a war it couldn't win industrially? Germany, Speer replied quietly, entered a war that was lost the moment America joined it. We simply lacked the resources to compete with American industrial capacity. The courtroom fell silent. Here was Hitler's armaments minister, the man who had performed an industrial miracle to keep Germany fighting, admitting that the miracle was never enough. That Germany had been fighting a mathematically impossible war from 1941 onward. Speer's testimony included specific details that shocked even hardened prosecutors. He described how Germany's entire annual steel production equaled roughly what America produced in 3 months. How American factories could retool to war production in weeks while German factories required months. How American workers, far from being the weak and decadent figures Nazi propaganda portrayed, were productive and innovative, suggesting improvements that increased efficiency. Hitler believed, Speer testified, that German fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. He believed 1 German soldier was worth 10 Americans. He was wrong. American soldiers fought with determination equal to anything Germany could offer. And they fought with unlimited supplies of ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment. The prosecutors asked about the Eastern Front. How had Germany lost so many tanks? Speer's answer was mathematical. The Soviet Union had more tanks because it produced more tanks. Soviet factories, evacuated east beyond the reach of German bombers, operated continuously. American Lend-Lease supplies supplemented Soviet production. Germany destroyed Soviet tanks by the thousands, but new ones kept arriving. At Kursk in July 1943, Speer explained, Germany committed approximately 3,000 tanks to the offensive. We lost perhaps 800, but the Soviets lost nearly 6,000 tanks and still won the battle. They could replace their losses. We couldn't. That was the pattern across the entire Eastern Front. Attrition favored the side with greater production. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts came down. Albert Speer was found guilty on 2 counts: war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically his use of slave labor. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment at Spandau prison in Berlin. 3 judges had argued for the death penalty. Speer's acceptance of responsibility, his candor about Germany's failures, and his defiance of Hitler's scorched earth orders had saved his life. In Spandau prison, Speer began writing. Prison regulations forbade memoirs, but Speer circumvented this by smuggling out writings through sympathetic guards. By November 1953, he had completed a manuscript that would become Inside the Third Reich, published after his release in 1969. The book became a bestseller, offering unprecedented insight into Nazi Germany's inner workings. But more importantly for our story, it contains Speer's most complete analysis of why Germany lost the war. In the book's chapters on armaments production, Speer laid out the brutal mathematics. He wrote about visiting Hitler in early 1942 and seeing intelligence reports about American production capacity. The numbers had terrified him. America was just beginning its industrial mobilization, and already the figures exceeded Germany's best projections. I realized, Speer wrote, that we were trying to fight the world's largest industrial power with resources inadequate to the task. It was like watching a mathematical equation work itself out. The variables were set. The outcome was determined. We simply hadn't reached the conclusion yet. Speer described watching American bombers darken German skies in 1944 and 45. Each bomber represented American industrial capacity he couldn't match. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the primary American heavy bomber, wasn't technologically superior to German aircraft. But America produced 12,731 of them. Germany shot down thousands. More kept coming. American philosophy, Speer wrote, was different from ours. We tried to build perfect weapons in limited numbers. They built good enough weapons in unlimited numbers. A Sherman tank wasn't as good as a Panther. But America built 50,000 Shermans. We built 6,000 Panthers. The mathematics weren't complicated. The book revealed Speer's understanding that World War II had been an industrial war, not a military war. Tactics mattered. Strategy mattered. But production capacity mattered more. The side that could replace losses faster would eventually win any extended conflict. Speer also wrote candidly about German leadership's refusal to accept this reality. Hitler believed in willpower and fighting spirit. He dismissed concerns about production numbers as defeatism. When Speer presented evidence of American industrial superiority, Hitler accused him of lacking faith in German victory. Hitler, Speer wrote, lived in a fantasy world where determination could overcome material disadvantages. He believed propaganda that Americans were weak and divided. He refused to accept intelligence showing American production capacity. He convinced himself that one decisive battle would break American will, even as American factories produced weapons faster than we could destroy them. The book described specific moments of realization. In late 1943, Speer received reports about the American automotive industry converting to war production. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and dozens of smaller manufacturers had shifted from cars to tanks, trucks, aircraft engines, and munitions. The scale astounded him. America, Speer wrote, had more automotive production capacity than all of Europe combined. When that capacity turned to military production, the result was inevitable. We couldn't compete. We had never been able to compete. Speer was released from Spandau on October 1, 1966. After serving his full 20-year sentence. He emerged into a Germany transformed, economically prosperous, and politically stable. He spent his remaining years writing and giving interviews, always returning to the themes he had explored in his interrogations and memoir. In interviews during the 1970s, Speer was asked repeatedly about Germany's defeat. His answer never changed. Germany lost because it couldn't match Allied production, particularly American production. The technological quality of German weapons, the fighting skill of German soldiers, the tactical brilliance of German commanders, all of these advantages meant nothing against overwhelming material superiority. "We made beautiful tanks," Speer said in one interview. "The Americans made lots of tanks. In industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own." Speer died on September 1, 1981, while visiting London. He was 76 years old. By then, historians had begun seriously analyzing the industrial aspects of World War II, and Speer's testimony, both at Nuremberg and in his writings, provided crucial primary source material. What modern historians have discovered supports everything Speer told his interrogators in May 1945. The numbers, independently verified through production records from all combatants, confirm the staggering disparity between American industrial capacity and German capacity. From 1939 to 1945, the United States produced approximately 2 million military vehicles of all types. Germany produced 650,000. America produced 2.3 million machine guns. Germany produced 674,000. America produced 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Germany produced about 15 billion. The disparity extended to resources. America produced more aluminum, necessary for aircraft construction, than all Axis powers combined. America produced more rubber, both natural and synthetic. America had access to unlimited petroleum supplies while Germany struggled constantly with fuel shortages that by 1944 had become critical. Strategic bombing, which Speer had discussed extensively in his interrogations, accelerated Germany's decline but didn't cause it. Even without bombing, Germany couldn't have matched Allied production. The bombing campaign forced Germany to divert resources to air defense, thousands of anti-aircraft guns that could have been used as anti-tank weapons, thousands of fighters that could have supported ground operations, millions of workers engaged in rebuilding bomb facilities rather than producing new weapons. But the fundamental problem remained: scale. America's industrial capacity was simply too large for Germany to compete with. When you added British production and Soviet production, the disparity became insurmountable. Modern economic historians have calculated that in 1944, the Allies collectively produced about 4 times the military hardware that Germany produced. This ratio held across virtually every category: ships, aircraft, tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition, 4-to-1. And unlike Germany, which was fighting on multiple fronts against enemies attacking from all directions, the Allies could concentrate production knowing their homelands were safe from invasion. The story of Albert Speer's admissions about American industrial superiority reveals a fundamental truth about World War II. The war wasn't decided primarily on battlefields. It was decided in factories, shipyards, and steel mills. It was decided by workers on assembly lines, by engineers designing production processes, by a nation that could mobilize industrial capacity on a scale the world had never seen. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft and weak, as materialistic individualists who lacked the fighting spirit of disciplined Germans. This propaganda wasn't just wrong, it was catastrophically wrong. American individualism translated into innovation on factory floors. American materialism meant building things efficiently and in massive quantities. American democracy, far from weakening resolve, produced unity in crisis that totalitarianism couldn't match. Speer understood this because he had seen the numbers. He had watched German factories struggle to produce weapons while American factories poured them out. He had seen German soldiers equipped with whatever could be scraped together while American soldiers had everything they needed and more. He had watched the mathematical equation of industrial warfare work itself to its inevitable conclusion. The tanks tell the story most clearly. Germany lost approximately 43,000 tanks on the Eastern Front alone. Total German tank production from 1939 to 1945 was about 46,000 vehicles. Germany essentially lost its entire tank production just fighting the Soviet Union, while still having to fight in Italy, France, and North Africa, while defending German skies against bombing raids, while maintaining occupation forces across conquered Europe. The Soviets produced 99,000 tanks during the war. The Americans produced 88,000. The British produced 28,000. Total Allied tank production exceeded 3 times total German production. And this doesn't account for the thousands of American tanks sent to Allied armies through Lend-Lease. Every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable. Every Allied tank destroyed was replaced within weeks. That was the mathematics Speer had tried to explain to Hitler. That was the reality Nazi leadership refused to accept until Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin and American armies crossed the Rhine. In his final interviews before his death, Speer was asked if Germany could have won the war under any circumstances. His answer was unequivocal. No. Not against the industrial capacity of the United States. Not against enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Not in a war where victory required matching production that exceeded Germany's capacity by 4-1. We were, Speer said, trying to fight an industrial war with inadequate industry. It was impossible from the start. We just didn't know it. The lesson of Speer's admissions extends beyond World War II. Modern warfare, he recognized, is industrial warfare. The nation that can produce more weapons, equip more soldiers, and maintain supply lines over vast distances will prevail in extended conflicts. Tactical skill, strategic brilliance, technological innovation, all matter. But production capacity matters more. American military doctrine learned this lesson well. The United States military today maintains not just technological superiority but logistical superiority. The ability to project force anywhere in the world, to supply armies across oceans, to replace losses quickly, these capabilities trace directly to lessons learned in World War II. Germany learned different lessons. The post-war German military, both West and East, emphasized quality over quantity, professional soldiers over mass armies, and defensive capabilities over offensive projection. They remembered what Speer had tried to tell Hitler. In industrial warfare, you cannot win without adequate industry. There's a broader point here about human nature and warfare. Hitler and his generals convinced themselves that German superiority was racial, spiritual, ideological. They believed Germans were inherently better than their enemies. This belief blinded them to mathematical reality. They ignored intelligence showing American production capacity. They dismissed evidence of Soviet industrial mobilization. They constructed a fantasy where willpower could overcome material disadvantage. Speer, as Germany's armaments minister, couldn't afford fantasy. He dealt with production numbers daily. He saw the gap between what Germany could produce and what the war required. He understood that every promise of wonder weapons, every claim that one German soldier equaled 10 Americans, every assertion of racial superiority was meaningless against the industrial capacity of nations that could outproduce Germany 4-1. And so, on that morning in May 1945, sitting in Glucksburg Castle answering questions from American interrogators, Albert Speer told the truth. A truth that cost his nation everything. A truth that Nazi ideology couldn't accept. A truth that historical records have confirmed in every detail. Germany lost World War II because it couldn't match Allied industrial production, particularly American production. All the tactical victories, all the advanced weapons, all the fighting spirit in the world couldn't overcome that fundamental disparity. The war was lost, as Speer had said, the moment America entered it. Everything after that was just Germany slowly bleeding to death in a mathematically unwinnable war. The tanks tell the story. Tens of thousands destroyed on the Eastern Front. Tens of thousands produced by American factories. The mathematics weren't complicated. One side could replace losses. The other side couldn't. Industrial capacity determined the outcome. Albert Speer understood this in 1942. He tried to tell Hitler. Hitler wouldn't listen. By 1945, when Speer sat in that interrogation room, the mathematical equation had worked itself out to its inevitable conclusion. Germany lay in ruins. The industrial power that Speer had tried to build couldn't match the industrial power arrayed against it. The numbers had never lied. Speer had just been the only one willing to believe them. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed even a little bit, reward yourself, hit subscribe. It's free, no war, no injuries.